This was an area located several kilometers northeast of Norrportal. Surrounding the small town were many villages, with the land being soft and sandy. Due to its dependence on rainfall, the region was more barren than cultivated. In some places, there was little more than sparse shrubs. There were 6 friends wandering through one such area, holding nets in their hands. They were all between the ages of 18 and 20. Along with them were 2 lean hunting dogs with long muzzles known for their speed and expertise in catching rabbits. Often the group would go out in the evenings to hunt rabbits and roam around until nightfall. Sometimes they succeeded in catching one, but other times they would return empty-handed. This was their first visit to this specific area, brought here by one of their own friends, who had heard from someone that rabbits had been sighted there. Since the place was far from their village, they had never ventured here before. Upon arrival, they released the dogs and spread out in different directions. They began searching the sandy ground for rabbit tracks, venturing quite far. The dogs roamed ahead, sniffing the ground, darting here and there. Suddenly, the dogs stopped at one spot. They sniffed the ground and began digging the sand with their paws. Seeing this, the friends ran toward the dogs because the dogs only behaved this way when they caught the scent of a rabbit underground. Believing that the dogs had found a rabbit, they hurried to the spot. By the time they reached, the dogs had already dug a small hole and were busy digging further. They were also growling softly, a sound they only made when they saw or sensed something. More sand was displaced, but nothing was visible yet. There was no burrow or sign suggesting that rabbits lived there. The friends called the dogs back, but the dogs were engrossed in their task. When the friends tried to pull them away, the dogs slipped out of their hands and attempted to return to the spot. The boys grew suspicious of the dogs' behavior, sensing that there was something underground that the dogs could feel. They decided to dig at the spot together. Without proper tools for digging, they relied on their hands and pieces of wood. If it weren't for the soft sand, they wouldn't have been able to dig at all. After much effort, they managed to clear the sand, revealing an old, decayed wooden chest beneath. They thought they had stumbled upon a great treasure. Faces lit with joy and eyes brimming with curiosity, they eagerly opened the chest. But the moment they lifted the lid, their expressions froze, and their eyes widened in shock. Inside the chest were 2 human skeletons. They recoiled in terror, stepping back instinctively. Standing around the chest, they stared at the skeletal remains, their fear growing with every passing second. Suddenly, the dogs began barking aggressively, their eyes fixed on something invisible in the air. They growled and backed away nervously before bolting away in fear. A wave of dread spread across the faces of all the boys. The eerie silence that followed only deepened their terror. "Basit Ali, you've got a letter." The policeman slid a piece of paper through the barred door, leaving Basit in utter disbelief. And why wouldn't he be? It was the first time in 13 years that something had arrived for him. "Who sent this?" Basit asked, taking the paper with a look of astonishment. "I don't know. Some girl," the officer replied indifferently. "A girl?" Bassett's mouth fell open in astonishment. "Yes, a girl," the policeman said, emphasizing the word girl with a smirk, flashing his teeth. "She even told me her name. I just can't remember," the officer added, scratching his forehead as if trying to jog his memory. "It's been 4 or 5 hours since this happened, so I've forgotten her name. To be honest, I had completely forgotten about this paper too. I only remembered it just now when I saw you while passing by. I'm still surprised I even took this paper from her," he continued. "She met me outside the jail. She asked about you by name, wondering if there was a prisoner here by that name. I told her there are several prisoners with that name. Then she clarified, it's the one serving a sentence for his wife's murder. That's when I realized she was talking about you. I told her, yes, Basit is here. That's when she handed me this piece of paper and said, give this to Basit. I don't know why, but I couldn't refuse her, even if I wanted to." The officer trailed off, looking thoughtful. "The strange thing is that it never even occurred to me to read it," the policeman had said, lost in his own thoughts. Basit stood there silently, staring at him, his mind a haze. Some of what the officer said made sense to him, while some did not, because while Bassett was physically present, his mind was elsewhere. The policeman eventually left, but Bassett remained standing in the same spot, unmoving. Suddenly, the sound of a car horn broke the silence. Perhaps a vehicle had entered the premises. Startled by the noise, Bassett looked around as though he had been abruptly woken from a deep sleep. The piece of paper was still in his hand. Caught up in the officer's words, Bassett hadn't even thought to read what was written on it. Confused, he unfolded the paper. As he read the words, a jolt ran through him. On the paper was written a single line: "Listen, you are not a part of my existence. You are my existence, and I am your soul. Without each other, we are incomplete. Ruby." The moment Bassett read the words and the name written at the bottom of the note, a jolt ran through him. The paper slipped from his hand and fell to the ground. He stood frozen, staring at the paper lying on the floor with wide eyes. This is impossible," Bassett whispered to himself. "This can't be. No, it's not possible." His legs gave out and he sank to the floor. Ruby. Ruby was the name of his wife, who had died 13 years ago. Bassett had been serving a life sentence for her murder ever since. The words written on the paper were Bassett's own, words he had whispered to his wife in moments of deep affection, over and over again. Bassett's mind raced. If this note truly came from Ruby, then why hadn't she come to see me? And if she were alive, where had she been all these years? These questions shook Bassett to his core. No one else could have written these words. Firstly, they were intimate, shared only between him and Ruby. Even if Ruby had told someone else, why would they bother bringing them up now, after all this time? What could they possibly gain from it? Whatever the truth was, the note had unleashed a storm of thoughts in Bassett's mind. Although Bassett had never truly forgotten Ruby, time had somewhat numbed his pain, allowing him to endure his sentence. But today, this mysterious note with its hauntingly familiar words reopened wounds he thought had begun to heal. Every moment of his past, every memory, came rushing back to him with startling clarity. The past, those beautiful years before the 13 spent in prison. Every moment of that time was precious to Bassett, especially the one when he first laid eyes on Ruby. He had gone to another village to attend a relative's wedding. The village wasn't far, so Bassett left home in the afternoon and reached the wedding house before evening. He was warmly welcomed and treated with great hospitality. The next day was the wedding ceremony, but there wasn't much of a Mendy function. That night, a small group of women and girls held a simple ritual at home. Bassett stood quietly on one side, observing. It was then that his eyes fell on Ruby, though he learned her name later. She was being playfully dragged forward by another girl who was trying to make her apply henna. Ruby, however, kept refusing. The scene brought a smile to Bassett's lips. Eventually, the girl trying to drag Ruby gave up in frustration. She said something to Ruby in anger, but Ruby only smiled in response. Annoyed, the girl left her and went to the other side. The next day, the wedding procession, Bharat, was to travel to a nearby village. Bassett had come with the intention of returning home immediately after the Bharat returned. But now, he didn't feel like leaving. Even after the wedding feast, Walima, the following day, Bassett lingered around the house. Ruby crossed his path several times, but he couldn't muster the courage to say anything to her. He simply watched her silently. By evening, Bassett knew he had to leave. But before going back, he wanted to find out more about the girl who had caught his attention. Gathering his courage, Bassett approached one of his female relatives and asked, "Who is that girl?" The woman smiled knowingly at his question. She told him Ruby's name and address, adding with a grin, "She's unmarried. If you're interested, you can send your brother and sister-in-law to talk about a proposal." Bassett was overjoyed. He took his leave and returned home. A few days later, he confided in his elder sister-in-law, telling her everything and requesting her to visit Ruby's family. 2 days later, Bassett's family members arrived at Ruby's house with a marriage proposal for her. He had gone to another village to attend a relative's wedding. The village wasn't very far, so Bassett left home in the afternoon and reached the wedding house before evening. He was warmly welcomed and treated with great hospitality. The wedding procession, Barat, was scheduled for the next day. There wasn't any grand Mendi function, just a simple ceremony held at home by the women and girls that night. Bassett stood quietly on one side, observing the gathering. It was there that his eyes fell on Ruby, though he learned her name later. She was being playfully dragged forward by another girl who was trying to make her apply henna. Ruby, however, kept refusing. The sight brought a smile to Bassett's face. Eventually, the girl trying to pull Ruby gave up in frustration. She said something to Ruby in anger, but Ruby only smiled in response. Annoyed, the girl left her alone and went to the other side. The next day, the Barat was set to travel to a nearby village. Bassett had come with a plan to return home immediately after the Barat came back, but now he didn't feel like leaving. Even after the wedding feast, Walima, Bassett lingered around the house. Ruby crossed his path several times, but he couldn't do anything except silently watch her. As evening approached and it was time for him to leave, Bassett decided he needed to know more about the girl who had caught his attention. Gathering his courage, he asked one of his female relatives, "Who is that girl?" The woman smiled knowingly and replied, giving Ruby's name and address. She added, "The girl is still unmarried. If you're interested, you can send your brother and sister-in-law to talk about a proposal." Bassett was overjoyed. He took his leave and returned home. A few days later, he confided in his elder sister-in-law, telling her everything and asking her to visit Ruby's family. 2 days later, Bassett's family went to Ruby's house with a marriage proposal for her. Bassett was educated, good-looking, and owned a large general store. He was also building a house on a separate plot of land he had purchased. His family lived near the city, owning significant land that was valued in the millions per marla. In short, there was no reason for Ruby's family to refuse the proposal. Ruby's family visited to see Bassett, liked him, and gave their approval. A few days later, their engagement was finalized. 6 or 7 months later, Ruby became Bassett's bride and moved into his house. The engagement lasted for 6 or 7 months, only because Bassett's house wasn't ready. Otherwise, he would have gone for a quick engagement and wedding. When Ruby saw Bassett, she was pleasantly surprised. She had seen this face before. Bassett's constant gazes at Ruby during the wedding hadn't gone unnoticed by her. She had seen the admiration in his eyes. However, at the time, it hadn't meant much to her. Now, seeing Bassett as her husband, Ruby felt content. Bassett didn't hide anything from her. He openly admitted that she was his first and last choice. He had seen her at the wedding, liked her, and immediately sent a proposal. For Bassett, it was love at first sight, but now it was mutual. Both of them had grown to love and cherish each other deeply. They were overjoyed. Bassett couldn't believe how easily and quickly his dream had come true. For the first time in his life, he had liked a girl, and now that girl was his wife. Perhaps this was the beauty of life. What could be more beautiful than this? Days turned into months. 2 years after their marriage, they were blessed with a son. Their already beautiful life became even more perfect. They named their son Sayem, a name chosen by both of them. Occasionally, there would be small arguments between Bassett and Ruby, but they never let things escalate. They always found a way to resolve their differences with love and understanding. Sometimes, when they argued, they needed no third person to mediate. Regardless of who was at fault, they would reconcile on their own after a while and return to their usual selves. Ruby had only one concern. Bassett occasionally suffered from strange episodes during which he lost control over himself. Although these episodes lasted only a few hours, during that time, Bassett would act like a complete stranger to everyone around him. It seemed as though he were possessed, but there was no supernatural cause. According to the doctors, Bassett had a psychological condition. They consulted several top specialists, and while the episodes didn't completely stop, they significantly reduced in frequency and intensity. By the time their son, Siam, turned 5, life seemed to have stabilized, but everything changed one evening when the police came and arrested Bassett for Ruby's murder. The murder weapon, a sharp dagger, was recovered from him. The dagger was stained with Ruby's blood, and Bassett's fingerprints were found on its handle. To be continued. Let me know your thoughts on this story. Thank you.